Okay. Then we can move on to the next thing. And this is, so the next practice that he talk about is suspending. And the corresponding speech act is bystanding. So as you remember, bystanding is this where you take a step back, you see the broader perspective, and you say something about that broader perspective. One of my favorite examples here is I was talking to a manager who mentioned a meeting with the top management in their organization, and they had just purchased a new building, and they had to figure out something about a parking solution. So there are different possibilities. You can purchase a parking lot. You can reimburse employees for what it costs to park in different places near the building and so on. So there is a few options, and you could say, well, how many people come to work by car, and there would be like a little bit of different in cost for the different options. And they spent an hour discussing it. And at some point, this guy, he was like, look, the maximum we can save by making a good choice is this amount. The price of having the top management team spend an hour on a topic is far exceeds anything we could possibly save. We should just pick one and get on with it. Right. So, but people got drawn into the argumentation, and they had all these like pros and cons, and I think sometimes also in management teams, it's a little bit of a relief to discuss something as concrete as purchasing a parking lot or not, right? And so sometimes it's like we avoid the harder problems by spending a lot of time talking about the easier problems. And of course, then it's good to make a bystand and say, like, this is not what we're supposed to spend time on. It's rare that we can get everybody in the top management team together. We should really discuss the kind of things that can only be addressed by this team. So this is an example of a bystand. In general, you can say bystands points to and questions the taken for granted assumptions that a dialogue or a conversation is based upon. So it addresses the kind of taken for granted assumptions that everybody is operating from. And this is key. So in suspending, one of the personal practices is suspend certainty. Try to figure out what is it that you're absolutely certain about, and then question it. It's nice to revisit those kind of things every now and then, because sometimes when you revisit it, you discover that what you were certain about wasn't actually necessarily true. And another thing he talks about is abide in the not knowing. So this is this thing about sometimes you are discussing a hard problem that doesn't have any particular easy solution, and so you don't know what the solution is, and it's kind of, many people find it uncomfortable to not know, to not have a clear idea of where to go. And so what we often do is that we try to get quickly to an answer. But when we get quickly to an answer, we often don't think sufficiently about it. We get quickly to an answer. We say, okay, this is the answer we're going to go with. And then we put something into action. And then 3, 6, 12 months later, we see that was a really bad decision. And now it's really costly to change it. If we had used half an hour more to reflect on it and found a better solution, we could have saved a lot of money. So it's really important to be comfortable with hanging out, with not knowing, saying, we don't know it, but let's talk about it. Rather than following this natural impulse to collapse the discussion and around a particular solution. Another thing that he talks about, which I really like, is trying frame experiments. So frames are basically, they are a form of taken for granted assumptions. A very simple thing would be, you might think that I don't know, firing people is a bad thing that should be avoided, right? That might be an assumption. And so it can be very interesting to ask yourself the question, under what circumstances is it actually a really good thing? Or if you're doing, SWOT analysis, like this typical where you have strengths and weaknesses and threats and opportunities, and you fill in the four boxes, it can be super interesting to see what if some of the things that are in the threat box, what if we look at them not as threats but as opportunities, then what we can see. This is an example of a frame experiment, right? We just assume our competitor is I don't know, buying up a lot of smaller businesses in our industry, and we think they are turning into a threat. What if we look at that sort of consolidation that's happening over there as an opportunity for us? What would that be? You see, so you try to switch basic assumptions, and sometimes that's a fantastic way of opening up your mind and seeing new things. So frame experiments are really cool. What are the frames that we are operating from? What if we just flip them to the diametrically opposite? Then what we can see. Can you see how that is a bystand? If somebody in the meeting says, this thing that we have identified as a threat, what if we took some time and thought about it as an opportunity? That would be a bystand. Another thing that is very useful, which I hope we have time to do today, is externalization of thought. I have worked a lot with this. So you can't hold much in your mind at any given moment. Unfortunately, we're like that, right? It's limited how much we can hold in our minds at any given moment. So that means that we're only going to focus on a part of an issue at any given moment. But if we externalize our thoughts, if we build a model, if we put something down on paper, we can see the whole system represented in front of us. And this is why sometimes in organizations you can do something as simple as put out a big sheet of paper and ask the management team to collectively draw the organization. And sometimes if I feel more adventurous, I make them build the organization in Lego, or I have this wonderful material, which it's a form of plastic, but when you put it in hot water, it becomes moldable, and you mold it into something, and you leave it for like a minute, and it gels into completely hard plastic. It's super fun to play with. And sometimes I just say, like, mold your organization in this plastic. And the reason I use different materials is because the material has an impact on the material you're building your model in has an impact on what comes out. There's a wonderful paper called Material Matters, written by two of my friends, and they have been working a lot with Lego and with clay, and they say for some reason when we work with Lego, everything is so rational and clear cut, and when we work with clay, all the emotions come out. And they say they think it's because of the material lends itself better to those things. Anyway, when you recorded a conversation and transcribed it and coded it, that is a form of externalizing thought, because now you can look at the whole thought process on paper and you can sort of analyze it. But I hope we'll get the chance to do the paper thing today as well, because it's really fun. Another thing is ask, what am I missing? Simple question, right? So just say, what am I missing? That is a very potent question. What am I missing? What haven't we talked about? What haven't we seen? So that's a very simple way of trying of practicing the capacity of suspending. And then there's the last one, which I find, again, this is probably my favorite. And Isaacs call it seek the order in between. And seeking the order in between, the way he describes it is, he says, often in a dialogue or in a conversation, you might have two opposing views. Like, I think it's good, I think it's bad. I think we should do it, I think we shouldn't do it. I think we should do A, I think we should do B, right? And then you argue. Like, here's all the pros and cons for this and the pros and cons for this, and you're trying to make a decision. And the natural question that we would ask in that situation is, who's right? Right? That's normal. And then you think pros and cons and you try to decide who's right. But a very interesting question to ask is, what are the assumptions that produces this conversation? What are the underlying assumptions that are producing the debate? And in the book, Isaacs has an interesting example. He says, you know about affirmative action, the principle of affirmative action. If you have a group of people that historically have been underprivileged, then you can sort of give them certain privileges, or you can make it easier for them to, for example, in the US it would be African Americans who have, the system has been stacked against them in certain ways, and so they say, well, there's a lot of talent in that group, but we won't get the benefit of that. The society won't benefit from that talent unless they get the opportunities. And so they have these different programs to make it easier for African Americans, for example, to get into a university, or have supports or grants specifically for African Americans or something like that. And then they say, well, that's fantastic, because then they get the opportunity, and then if they have it in them, they can get fantastic careers. And so he has this, and there's of course arguments for and against. The people who argue for it is like, well, we need to do something to counteract the anti forces that prevents them from getting opportunities. So we need to do something actively to counteract that. And other people say, well, but that's like preferential treatment, and it should be based on merit and all these kind of things. So there's arguments for and against this thing. And so Isaacs in the book says, you can ask the question, are you for or against the kind of affirmative action that produced Colin Powell? So Colin Powell was Secretary of State for a long time. He was a politician, African-American politician, who had a good career. And then you can discuss, right? Is it, if affirmative action can produce somebody like Colin Powell, then should it be there, or should it not be there for other reasons? And you discuss back and forth. But what is the underlying assumption that this whole debate is taken for granted? Can anybody spot it? What is it that both sides kind of take for granted here? That's not questioned. So we ask, should we have affirmative action or not when it produces people like Colin Powell? The underlying assumption is, of course, that yes, that it was affirmative action that enabled him to have the career that he was. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else. And so this is super interesting. When you are debating something, ask yourself, what is the underlying assumptions that both sides of the argument take for granted? And if you question that often produces really interesting bystands, really interesting insights. Yes. Good. So, interesting. Actually, what I was talking about before, I just see I flipped them. The group practices for this is the clearance committee. And the other group practice is speaking to and from the center. That's the group practices for suspending, not for voicing, as I said before. So and here it's like you can see how the addressing the underlying assumptions that the whole group is having, that is speaking to and from the center. Looking at the group as if it's one organism, rather than looking at the individuals in the group and addressing them, then looking at the whole group as if the whole group was one organism, and asking the question, how is this group operating? How is this group functioning? And how is the way the group is functioning impacting the individuals within the group? Right? And it's a super interesting question there's a lot where David Cantor, for example, he comes from like family psychology or group psychology. And so when he looks at speech acts, the unit of analysis is the group, right? When you analyzed your conversation, you were saying the group has this distribution of the four speech acts. It wasn't so important what the individual has, but it's important what the group has. And you might see this group has a little bit of move and a lot of follow. And so as a group, that means something of how the group operates. And if you say, let's bring in some more bystanders and some more opposing, you're addressing the group, you're not addressing any specific individuals. And this is about speaking to and from the center. Does that make sense?